The classroom smelled like chalk dust and old books, the kind of smell that sticks to your clothes long after the school bell rings. In the back corner, near the window that looked out onto the playground, sat a 7-year-old boy with dark hair that never quite stayed combed and shoes that had seen better days. His name was Danny, and if you asked anyone in Mrs. Rivera's second-grade class about him, they'd probably say he was quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you easy to forget about. Easy to overlook when the teacher is calling on students or handing out special jobs for the day. Danny lived with his grandmother in a small apartment on the edge of town, the kind of place where the paint peels off the walls in the summer heat, and the radiator clanks all night in winter. His parents weren't in the picture anymore. Nobody really talked about why, and Danny had learned not to ask questions that made his grandmother's eyes go sad. She worked 2 jobs, one cleaning offices downtown before the sun came up, and another one in the evenings at a grocery store, scanning items and bagging purchases until her feet ached so bad she had to soak them in Epsom salt when she got home. But no matter how tired she was, no matter how late she worked or how early she had to wake up, his grandmother always made sure Danny had lunch for school. Every single morning, before the sky even turned light, she'd be in their tiny kitchen wrapping up a peanut butter sandwich in aluminum foil. She'd add an apple, sometimes a little bruised but still good, and a small juice box that she bought in bulk because they were cheaper that way. Then she'd tuck everything into a brown paper bag and write his name on it in her shaky handwriting. The letters big and careful, like she was writing something important. Danny never told her that some of the other kids had fancy lunch boxes with cartoon characters on them, or that they brought things like string cheese and crackers shaped like fish and fruit snacks in pouches. He never mentioned that sometimes the other kids wrinkled their noses at his plain sandwich, or that once, a boy named Tyler asked him if he ate the same thing every single day. Danny had just shrugged and said he liked peanut butter, which was true enough. What he didn't say was that his grandmother stood at that kitchen counter every morning making sure he had something to eat, and that was worth more than all the fancy snacks in the world. School was okay for Danny. He wasn't the best student, but he wasn't the worst either. He liked art class because nobody cared if you colored outside the lines, and he liked recess because he could just sit under the big oak tree and watch the clouds instead of trying to join the kickball games, where everyone already had their teams figured out. But his favorite part of the day, the part he looked forward to more than anything else, was being in Mrs. Rivera's classroom. Mrs. Rivera was young, probably not much older than some of the parents who dropped their kids off in the morning. This was her first year teaching, and you could tell because she still got excited about things that the older teachers barely noticed. She'd make a big deal when someone got all their spelling words right, and she'd put gold stars on papers that just had good effort, even if the answers weren't perfect. Her bulletin boards were covered in colorful paper and student drawings, and she always had a smile ready, the kind that made you feel like maybe you were doing okay even when you weren't sure. Danny noticed things about people. It was something about being quiet all the time. When you're not talking, you end up watching instead, and you see things that other people miss. He noticed that Mrs. Rivera wore the same 3 outfits in rotation, mixing them up with different scarves to make them look different. He noticed that her car, an old sedan that coughed when it started, was always parked in the far corner of the teacher's lot. He noticed that she brought in supplies from home, her own pencils and markers and construction paper, because the school didn't give her enough. But the thing Danny noticed most, the thing that started to bother him more and more as the weeks went by, was what happened at lunchtime. Every day when the bell rang and all the kids pulled out their lunches, the other teachers would head to the faculty lounge down the hall. You could hear them laughing and chatting, taking their break. But Mrs. Rivera never left. She'd stay right there in the classroom, sitting at her desk while the kids ate. She'd tell them she wanted to keep them company, that she liked eating with her students. She always had a water bottle with her, and she'd sip from it while she graded papers or planned lessons. At first, Danny thought it was nice that she stayed with them. Some of the other kids did too. But then he started to notice something else. Mrs. Rivera never actually ate anything. She never pulled out a sandwich or opened a container of leftovers. She never had a granola bar or a bag of chips or anything at all. Just that water bottle, which she'd refill at the fountain when it got empty. One day, Danny was walking back from throwing away his lunch bag when he passed by her desk. Mrs. Rivera was bent over a stack of math worksheets, her red pen moving across the page. But next to the papers, half hidden under a folder, Danny saw something that made his stomach do a little flip. It was an envelope, and across the front, in big red letters, he could see the words "Final Notice." There were more envelopes under that one, too, all with that same angry red ink stamping them with words like "past due" and "immediate payment required." Danny knew those envelopes. His grandmother got them sometimes. They'd come in the mail and she'd hold them in her hands for a long time before opening them, like she was afraid of what was inside. Sometimes she'd sit at their kitchen table after Danny went to bed, and he'd hear her crying softly while she tried to figure out which bill to pay first. The electric company didn't like to wait. Neither did the landlord. You had to pick and choose, decide what could wait another month and what couldn't. Looking at those envelopes on Mrs. Rivera's desk, Danny suddenly understood something that made his chest feel tight. His teacher wasn't staying in the classroom to be nice. She wasn't keeping them company because she enjoyed it. She was staying because she didn't have any lunch to take to the faculty lounge. She was staying because she couldn't afford to eat. Danny went back to his seat by the window and stared down at the empty space where his lunch bag had been. His grandmother had made that sandwich before dawn, had carefully wrapped it and packed it even though Danny knew they were running low on groceries. Even though he knew she'd probably skip lunch herself so he could have dinner that night. And here was Mrs. Rivera, who spent her own money on classroom supplies and stayed late every day to help students who were struggling. Going hungry day after day, that night, lying in his narrow bed while his grandmother worked her evening shift, Danny made a decision. He didn't know if it was the right decision or if it would even make a difference. But he knew he had to do something. He couldn't just sit there every day eating his sandwich while his teacher's stomach growled. His grandmother always told him that when you have something, even if it's not much, you share it with people who need it. She said that's what makes us human, that caring for each other part. So Danny decided. Tomorrow things were going to be different. The next morning started like any other. Danny's grandmother shook him awake while it was still dark outside, her hands gentle on his shoulder. She was already dressed in her cleaning uniform, ready to head downtown to vacuum offices and scrub bathrooms before the business people showed up for work. In the kitchen, his lunch sat waiting on the counter. The brown paper bag with his name written in those careful, shaky letters that always made him think of how hard she tried. Danny ate his cereal slowly, watching his grandmother move around their small kitchen. She was humming something soft under her breath, some old song from when she was young. Her hands shook a little as she poured herself coffee into a chipped mug. She was getting older and the work was getting harder, but she never complained. Not once had Danny ever heard her say it wasn't fair or that she was tired of struggling. "You got everything for school, baby?" she asked like she did every morning. "Yes, ma'am," Danny replied, which was what she'd taught him to say. She kissed the top of his head, and he could smell the faint scent of the industrial soap she used at work. Then she was out the door, her footsteps heavy on the stairs outside their apartment. Danny finished his cereal, brushed his teeth, grabbed his backpack and his lunch, and headed out to catch the bus. All morning in class, Danny couldn't focus. While Mrs. Rivera taught them about adding two-digit numbers, his mind kept wandering to what he'd seen yesterday, those red envelopes on her desk. While they practiced writing sentences about their favorite animals, he kept glancing up at his teacher, noticing the way her stomach would sometimes make a small noise that she'd try to cover by clearing her throat or shuffling papers. When the lunch bell finally rang, Danny's heart started beating faster. His palms felt sweaty against his desktop. All around him, kids were pulling out their lunches, the room filling with the sounds of rustling bags and opening containers. Some kids had hot lunch from the cafeteria, and the smell of pizza and corn wafted through the classroom. Others had packed lunches like his, though most of them were a lot fancier. Mrs. Rivera sat at her desk like always, pulling out her water bottle and a stack of reading quizzes to grade. She smiled at the class, that same warm smile she always had, and told them to enjoy their lunch. But Danny could see something in her eyes now that he'd never noticed before. A kind of tiredness that went deeper than just staying up late grading papers. The kind of tired that comes from trying to stay strong when everything feels heavy. For a moment, Danny just sat there with his lunch in front of him. His hands were shaking a little bit, and he wasn't sure if he could actually do what he'd planned. What if Mrs. Rivera got upset? What if the other kids made fun of him? What if his grandmother found out he'd given away the lunch she'd worked so hard to make for him? But then he remembered something his grandmother had told him once. They'd been at the grocery store, and there was a man outside asking for change. Danny had seen the way some people walked right past him, pretending they didn't see him there. But his grandmother, even though they barely had enough money for their own groceries, had stopped and given the man a few dollars. "Why'd you do that?" Danny had asked. "We need that money too." His grandmother had knelt down so she was eye level with him, her hands on his shoulders. "Baby," she'd said, "when you see someone who's hurting and you have something that can help, you don't walk past. You don't look away, you help. That's what it means to be a good person. Not having a lot of money or living in a fancy house. Just being willing to share what you have even when you don't have much." Danny thought about those words now. He looked down at his lunch, at the sandwich wrapped in aluminum foil, and the slightly bruised apple his grandmother had packed. Then he looked up at Mrs. Rivera, who was bent over her papers, probably trying to ignore her empty stomach. Before he could change his mind, Danny stood up. His chair scraped against the floor, and a few kids glanced over at him, but most of them were too busy with their own food to pay attention. Danny walked up to Mrs. Rivera's desk, his lunch clutched in both hands. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. Mrs. Rivera looked up when his shadow fell across her papers.
"Hey, Danny," she said, her smile a little puzzled.
"Everything okay?" For a second, Danny couldn't make his mouth work. His throat felt tight and he was suddenly afraid he might cry, which would be the worst thing ever. But then he managed to find his voice, and it came out small but steady. "I brought extra today," he said, setting his lunch bag on her desk. "My grandma always packs too much, and I can't eat it all. I thought maybe you'd want some." The change in Mrs. Rivera's face was instant. Her smile froze and her eyes went wide. Then they started to get shiny with tears that she was clearly trying to hold back. She looked down at the brown paper bag with Danny's name on it, then back up at him. "Danny," she said, and her voice sounded strange, kind of thick and wobbly. "I can't take your lunch." "That's your food. I'm not that hungry today," Danny lied. His stomach was actually growling, but he didn't care. "And my grandma really did pack a lot, please." Mrs. Rivera pressed her lips together, and Danny could see her struggling with something. Her hands were gripping the edge of her desk so tight her knuckles had gone white. A tear slipped down her cheek, and she quickly wiped it away, glancing around to make sure none of the other kids had noticed. "Are you sure?" she whispered. Danny nodded. He didn't trust himself to say anything else because if he kept talking, he was definitely going to start crying too, so he just nodded again and then quickly walked back to his seat before she could argue anymore. As he sat down, Danny saw Mrs. Rivera slowly open the paper bag. She pulled out the sandwich, unwrapping the aluminum foil with careful fingers, like it was something precious. Then she took a bite, and Danny watched as she closed her eyes for just a second. When she opened them again, there were more tears running down her cheeks. But she was smiling too. This real, genuine smile that made Danny's chest feel warm despite his empty stomach. The rest of lunch period was weird for Danny. He sat at his desk with nothing to eat, pretending to read a book from the classroom library. His stomach growled and complained, and he felt lightheaded in a way that made the words on the page swim around. But every time he glanced up and saw Mrs. Rivera eating that sandwich, saw the way her shoulders had relaxed a little bit, and some color had come back to her face, he felt okay about his choice. Some of the other kids noticed, of course. A girl named Sophie, who sat near Danny, leaned over and whispered, "Where's your lunch?" "Wasn't hungry," Danny said with a shrug, keeping his eyes on his book. "But you gave it to Mrs. Rivera," Sophie said. She wasn't being mean, just confused. "Why'd you do that?" Danny didn't know how to explain it in a way that would make sense. How could he tell Sophie, whose parents both had good jobs and who never had to worry about which bills got paid first, that sometimes the most important thing wasn't having enough for yourself, but making sure someone else didn't go without? So he just shrugged again and said, "She needed it more than me." Sophie looked at him for a long moment. Her forehead wrinkled up in thought, and then she did something that surprised Danny. She reached into her lunchbox and pulled out a bag of pretzels and a small container of grapes. "Here," she said, pushing them across to his desk. "You can have these. I brought too much too." Danny wanted to say no, wanted to tell her he was fine, but his stomach was making insistent noises and the pretzels looked really good. "Thanks," he mumbled, taking them. The pretzels and grapes weren't much, and Danny was still hungry when the lunch period ended. But it was something. And more than that, something had shifted in the classroom. Sophie kept glancing between Danny and Mrs. Rivera, her expression thoughtful. And Mrs. Rivera, who usually looked tired and stressed during afternoon classes, seemed to have more energy. Her voice was stronger, her smile came easier, and when she helped Danny with a math problem later, she squeezed his shoulder in a way that let him know she understood what he'd done and why. That afternoon, as the final bell rang and kids rushed out to catch their buses, Danny packed up his things slowly. Mrs. Rivera called out to him just as he reached the door. "Danny, wait a second." He turned around, suddenly nervous. Maybe she was going to tell him not to do that again. Maybe she was upset or embarrassed. But when he walked back to her desk, Mrs. Rivera knelt down so she was at his height, just like his grandmother had done that day outside the grocery store. Her eyes were red like she'd been crying, but she was smiling. "Thank you," she said quietly. "What you did today was one of the kindest things anyone has ever done for me. But I need you to know something. Your lunch is important. You need to eat so you can learn and grow. So tomorrow you eat your lunch, okay? Promise me." Danny looked at her, at this teacher who spent her own money on supplies and stayed late to help students and who was clearly struggling just as much as his grandmother did. "But what about you?" he asked. Mrs. Rivera's smile got a little wobbly again. "I'll figure something out," she said. "Adults always do. But you're a kid, and you need to take care of yourself. Deal?" Danny didn't answer right away, because he knew something Mrs. Rivera didn't seem to know. Sometimes adults didn't figure it out. Sometimes they just kept going hungry, kept struggling, kept pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. His grandmother did it all the time. "I'll think about it," was all Danny said, and then he hurried out to catch his bus before Mrs. Rivera could make him promise anything he wasn't ready to promise. Danny went home that day feeling strange. His stomach was still a little empty, but that wasn't what bothered him. What bothered him was the look on Mrs. Rivera's face when she'd taken that first bite of the sandwich. The way her hands had trembled. The tears she'd tried so hard to hide. He kept thinking about how she'd asked him to promise to eat his own lunch tomorrow, like she didn't matter as much as he did. That night, his grandmother came home from her evening shift at the grocery store smelling like floor cleaner, and tired in a way that seemed to go all the way to her bones. She heated up some rice and beans for dinner, and they ate together at their small kitchen table while she asked him about school. Danny told her about the math lesson and the book they were reading, but he didn't mention the lunch. He didn't know how to explain it without making his grandmother sad or worried. The next morning, Danny woke up with a plan. When his grandmother set his lunch on the counter, he looked at it for a long moment. Then while she was in the bathroom getting ready for work, he did something he'd never done before. He took half of the sandwich out of the aluminum foil, wrapped it in a napkin, and tucked it into a separate small bag he found under the sink. He put half the grapes in there too. Then he carefully rewrapped what was left so it wouldn't look too different. At school, when lunchtime came, Danny ate his half sandwich slowly, making it last, but he kept the small bag hidden in his backpack. When Mrs. Rivera was busy helping another student with their math worksheet, Danny quietly walked to her desk and slipped the bag into her bottom drawer, the one that was always slightly open where she kept extra pencils and erasers. He didn't say anything, didn't make a big show of it, just left it there and went back to his seat. About 20 minutes later, Mrs. Rivera reached into that drawer for a pencil. Danny saw her freeze, saw her pull out the small bag and look at it with wide eyes. Her gaze immediately went to Danny, sitting in his back corner seat, pretending to be very focused on his book. Their eyes met for just a second, and Danny saw her throat move as she swallowed hard. She mouthed the words, "Thank you," and Danny gave the tiniest nod before looking back down at his book. This became their routine. Danny would eat part of his lunch and save part for Mrs. Rivera. Sometimes he'd leave it in her drawer. Sometimes he'd set it on her desk when she stepped out of the room. He tried to be sneaky about it, but he wasn't. Very good at being sneaky, and soon other kids started to notice. Sophie was the first one to really understand what was happening. She watched Danny for a few days, saw the pattern, saw how Mrs. Rivera never brought lunch, and how Danny was always leaving food for her. One day, Sophie brought 2 sandwiches to school instead of 1. She walked up to Mrs. Rivera's desk during lunch and said, "My mom packed me 2 by accident. Do you want one?" Mrs. Rivera looked at Sophie, then at Danny, and her eyes got that shiny look again. "Your mom made a mistake?" she asked gently. Sophie was a terrible liar. Her face turned red and she shifted from foot to foot. Yeah, a mistake. She makes mistakes sometimes. Mrs. Rivera accepted the sandwich with a quiet thank you, and Sophie shot Danny a small smile as she went back to her seat. After that, it was like a door had opened. A boy named Kevin started bringing extra cookies. A girl named Lisa brought an extra juice box. Another kid brought crackers. They all had the same excuse. Their parents packed too much, or they weren't hungry, or it was just going to go to waste anyway. Nobody made a big announcement. Nobody talked about it openly. But every day, Mrs. Rivera's desk somehow ended up with bits and pieces of lunch that the kids in the class shared with her. Mrs. Rivera never said much about it. She'd thank each child quietly, and sometimes her voice would crack a little. At the end of each day, she'd stay late like always, but now she'd also write personal thank you notes to each kid who'd shared, slipping them into their desks before the next morning. Danny kept his notes in a special folder at home, reading them over and over. But sharing his lunch meant Danny was eating less, and his body started to show it. He got tired more easily. During PE, he couldn't run as fast as he used to. His face got a little thinner, and the shadows under his eyes got darker. His grandmother noticed at dinner one night. "You feeling okay, baby?" she asked, reaching across the table to touch his forehead. "You look pale." "I'm fine," Danny said, but his voice didn't sound convincing even to himself. His grandmother studied him with eyes that had seen too much in her life to be easily fooled. "You eating your lunch at school?" Danny nodded, which wasn't exactly a lie. He was eating lunch, just not all of it. But grandmothers have a way of knowing things without being told. A few days later, Danny came home to find extra food in his lunch bag. More than usual. His grandmother had packed him 2 sandwiches, extra fruit, more snacks. When he looked at her questioningly, she just said, "Growing boy needs energy. Make sure you eat it all." That night, lying in bed, Danny heard his grandmother on the phone with someone. Her voice was low, but he could still make out some of the words. She was asking about extra shifts at work, seeing if there were any hours available. She was trying to make more money so she could afford to pack him bigger lunches. Danny pulled his blanket up over his head and cried quietly into his pillow. He hadn't meant to make more work for his grandmother. She was already so tired. But he also couldn't stop thinking about Mrs. Rivera, about how much it meant to her to have something to eat, about how the whole class had come together to help her without even really talking about it. The next morning, with his bigger lunch packed and ready, Danny made a decision. He'd keep sharing, but he'd also make sure to eat enough himself. He'd find a balance somehow, because his grandmother was right that he needed food to grow. But Mrs. Rivera needed food too. They both did. Everyone did. At school that day, something different happened. During morning announcements, the principal mentioned that there was going to be a canned food drive for families in need. Mrs. Rivera perked up at this, her interest clearly caught. After the announcements, she talked to the class about it. "Sometimes people in our community don't have enough food," she explained. "So we're going to collect canned goods and non-perishable items to donate. If your family can bring something in, that would be wonderful." Danny listened carefully. An idea was forming in his mind. That afternoon, when his grandmother picked him up from school, she'd switched her shift so she could be there, which was rare and special. He asked her about it. "Can we bring some cans for the food drive?" His grandmother's expression was complicated. Danny knew what she was thinking. They were the kind of family who needed food drives, not the kind who donated to them. But then she smiled, tired but genuine. "I think we can manage a can or 2, she said. Over the next week, even though they had very little, Danny and his grandmother brought in a few cans of vegetables and soup to add to the growing collection in the classroom. It wasn't much compared to what some other families brought. Some kids came in with entire boxes of food. But it was something. Danny noticed that Mrs. Rivera looked at their small contribution the same way she looked at everything else, with gratitude and careful attention. She wrote down every donation in a notebook, and when Danny's name appeared on the list, she met his eyes and gave him a nod that said more than words could. But here's the thing Danny was beginning to understand. The food drive was helping people somewhere in the community, which was good, but it wasn't helping Mrs. Rivera. She was right there in the classroom, going hungry every day, and the system wasn't set up to help teachers who were struggling. There were programs for students who needed free lunch. There were programs for families who needed food assistance. But there wasn't anything obvious for a young teacher who was barely making ends meet. The sharing continued. Every day, little bits of lunch would find their way to Mrs. Rivera's desk. And every day she'd accept them with quiet thanks and eyes that couldn't quite hide how much it meant to her. The class had created their own system, their own way of taking care of someone they cared about. Then one day something changed. It was early December, and the weather had turned cold. Danny came to school to find Mrs. Rivera's usual smile missing. She looked more tired than ever, and there were dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't quite cover. During math time, a parent volunteer came in with a message, and Mrs. Rivera stepped into the hallway to take a phone call. Through the door, which hadn't closed all the way, Danny could hear part of the conversation. Mrs. Rivera's voice was low and stressed. "I understand, but I just need a little more time. The next paycheck is coming and I can pay then. Please don't. I understand." "Yes, I understand." When she came back into the classroom, her eyes were red, but she was trying to smile. She clapped her hands together and said brightly, "Okay, who can tell me what 7 times 8 is?" But Danny saw, and Sophie saw, and Kevin and Lisa and all the other kids who'd been quietly leaving food on Mrs. Rivera's desk saw. Something was wrong, something beyond just being hungry at lunchtime. That day at lunch, the usual routine happened. Kids shared their food. Mrs. Rivera accepted it with gratitude, but there was something different in the air, a tension that hadn't been there before. The kids could feel that their teacher was struggling with more than they could fix with sandwich halves and extra cookies. What they didn't know was that someone else had been noticing too. Someone who'd been watching the quiet kindness of these second graders, watching how they took care of their teacher day after day without being asked, without expecting anything in return. Someone who'd been moved by what he saw and was about to do something about it. But that part of the story was just beginning. And Danny, sitting in his back corner desk and watching his teacher pretend that everything was okay, had no idea that the small act of sharing his lunch was about to ripple out in ways he couldn't imagine. Sometimes kindness works like that. You do something small and quiet, not expecting anything, and it touches people you didn't even know were watching. It spreads like warmth on a cold day, reaching further than you ever intended. All Danny knew was that his teacher needed help. And even though he was just a kid with not much to give, he was going to keep giving what he could, because that's what his grandmother had taught him. That's what it meant to be human. His name was Tom Chen, and he'd been the night custodian at Riverside Elementary for almost 15 years. He was the kind of person who moved through the school, like a ghost after hours, mopping floors and emptying trash cans while the building sat silent and empty. Most teachers never saw him. Most students didn't even know his name. He was just part of the background, someone whose work happened while everyone else was home eating dinner or doing homework or watching TV. But Tom noticed things. When you work alone in a building at night, you start paying attention to the small details. You notice which classroom lights stay on longest. You notice whose car is still in the parking lot at 8 o'clock. You notice the contents of the trash cans and what they say about the people who fill them. And Tom had started noticing things about Mrs. Rivera's classroom. First, he'd noticed that her trash can was always full of student work, draft after draft of lesson plans, printed worksheets that she'd paid for herself when the school copies ran out. He'd noticed that she stayed late most nights, her little sedan the last car in the lot besides his own beat-up truck. He'd noticed the stack of past-due bills on her desk that she tried to hide under folders, the way they seemed to grow taller each week. But what really caught Tom's attention was the lunch situation. He'd started noticing it about a month ago, when he'd come in early one afternoon to fix a leaky sink in the teacher's lounge. He'd walked past Mrs. Rivera's classroom during lunch period and seen something that made him stop and watch through the window in the door. A small boy was placing a paper bag on Mrs. Rivera's desk. The teacher was clearly trying not to cry, and the boy walked back to his seat with nothing to eat. Tom had kept walking that day, not wanting to intrude on what felt like a private moment. But he couldn't stop thinking about it. The next day, he made a point of walking past the classroom during lunch again. And there it was, the same scene. the boy sharing his lunch, the teacher accepting it with tears in her eyes. Over the following weeks, Tom watched as more students joined in. He saw them bringing extra food, leaving it on Mrs. Rivera's desk with mumbled excuses about packing too much or not being hungry. He saw how carefully Mrs. Rivera would eat whatever they gave her, how she'd save the wrappers and bags to throw away at home, rather than in the classroom trash where the kids might see them. He saw how much it cost her to accept help from 7-year-olds who had barely anything themselves, and it broke his heart. Tom knew about struggling. He'd raised 3 kids on a custodian's salary after his wife passed away. He'd worked double shifts and eaten ramen for dinner so his kids could have school supplies and birthday presents. He'd swallowed his pride more times than he could count, accepting hand-me-down clothes from neighbors and using food stamps at the grocery store while trying not to notice the judgmental looks from other shoppers. He understood what Mrs. Rivera was going through because he'd been there. He knew what it felt like to smile through hunger, to pretend everything was fine when you weren't sure how you'd pay next month's electric bill, to accept kindness from people who had less than you, because refusing it would hurt them more than accepting it hurt your pride. But watching these second graders take care of their teacher felt wrong in a way Tom couldn't quite articulate. Not wrong like they were doing something bad. What they were doing was beautiful, actually. But wrong like the system was broken if children had to be the ones fixing it. So Tom started paying even closer attention. He learned that Mrs. Rivera was a first-year teacher, that she'd graduated with student loans that probably equaled more than her annual salary. He learned that she drove 40 minutes each way to get to school because she couldn't afford to live closer. He learned that she picked up tutoring jobs on weekends trying to make extra money. He learned all this just by watching, by listening to the conversations she had with other teachers, by piecing together the evidence he saw scattered throughout her classroom. One evening in early December, Tom was emptying the trash in Mrs. Rivera's room when he found something that made him act. It was an eviction notice, crumpled up and shoved to the bottom of the wastebasket like she'd been trying to hide it even from herself. The notice said she had 30 days to pay her back rent or find somewhere else to live. Tom stood there holding that piece of paper, and something in him shifted. He thought about his own kids, how teachers had helped them when he couldn't afford to. He thought about the boy who shared his lunch every day, about a classroom full of 7-year-olds who'd somehow figured out how to take care of each other better than most adults did. He thought about what kind of world it was where a teacher couldn't afford to eat lunch, let alone pay rent, and he decided to do something about it. The next morning, Tom went to see Principal Anderson. He'd worked at the school long enough to have a relationship with the principal, a kind woman in her 50s who genuinely cared about both students and staff. Tom knocked on her office door before his shift ended, still in his custodian uniform. "Tom," Principal Anderson said, looking up from her computer with surprise. "Everything okay? Something need fixing?" "Not exactly," Tom said, stepping into the office. "I need to talk to you about something." "About Mrs. Rivera." The principal's expression shifted to concern. "Is there a problem?" "Yes and no," Tom said. He sat down in the chair across from her desk, suddenly feeling nervous. "I don't want to betray anyone's privacy, but I've noticed some things and I think you should know." Then he told her everything. About the lunches, about the kids sharing their food, about the bills and the eviction notice and the car that barely ran, and the way Mrs. Rivera stayed late every night probably, because she didn't want to go home to an empty apartment where she couldn't afford to turn on the heat. Principal Anderson listened without interrupting, her expression growing more troubled with each detail. When Tom finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "I had no idea it was that bad," she finally said. "I knew she was struggling. First-year teachers always do financially, Mike, but I didn't realize." She trailed off, shaking her head. "The thing is," Tom said, "these kids, they're taking care of her. 7-year-olds are making sure their teacher has food to eat. And that's beautiful, but it's also wrong. It shouldn't be on them." "No," Principal Anderson agreed firmly. "It shouldn't." She pulled out a notepad and started writing. "Okay, let me see what I can do. We have emergency funds for staff in crisis. It's not much, but it's something. And I'll reach out to the teachers' union, see if they have resources. There might be programs I don't know about." Tom felt relief wash over him. "Thank you." "No, thank you," the principal said, meeting his eyes. "For paying attention, for caring enough to say something. A lot of people would have just looked the other way." That afternoon, Principal Anderson called Mrs. Rivera into her office. From what Tom heard later, it was an emotional conversation. Mrs. Rivera had tried to insist she was fine, that she didn't need help, that she could handle it. But Principal Anderson was gentle and firm, explaining that the school had resources, that asking for help wasn't weakness, that they couldn't afford to lose a teacher who clearly cared so much about her students. Within a few days, things started changing. The school provided Mrs. Rivera with an emergency grant that helped with her back rent. The teachers' union connected her with a financial counselor who helped her set up a payment plan for her student loans. Another teacher whose daughter had moved out offered to rent Mrs. Rivera a room in her house for half what she'd been paying for her apartment, cutting her commute down to 10 minutes. But perhaps most importantly, Principal Anderson quietly arranged for Mrs. Rivera to receive a meal stipend, a benefit that apparently existed but nobody had told her about. It wasn't much, but it meant she could afford to eat lunch every day. The change in Mrs. Rivera was visible. She smiled more. She had more energy. The dark circles under her eyes started to fade. And while she still stayed late to plan lessons and grade papers, there was a lightness to her now that hadn't been there before. The kids noticed too. They noticed that Mrs. Rivera had brought her own lunch one day, a simple salad in a container from home. Danny watched as she ate it at her desk, and for a moment he felt strange, like maybe he wasn't needed anymore. But then Mrs. Rivera looked up and caught his eye, and she smiled at him in a way that said everything he needed to know. She was okay now. He'd helped her get there, even though he was just a kid with a sandwich to share. But here's what made the whole situation even more meaningful. Mrs. Rivera didn't forget what the kids had done for her. One day after school, she gathered the students who'd been sharing their lunches and sat them down in a circle on the reading rug. "I want to thank you all," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "What you did for me these past few weeks was one of the most generous things anyone has ever done. You shared what you had even when you didn't have much to share. You saw someone who needed help and you helped them without being asked." Sophie raised her hand. "Are you okay now, Mrs. Rivera?" "I am," Mrs. Rivera said, nodding. "I'm getting help from the school and from other people, and I want you to know that if you ever need help, you can ask for it too. There's no shame in needing support. We all need help sometimes." Danny thought about his grandmother, about how she never asked for help even when she clearly needed it. He thought about how hard it must have been for Mrs. Rivera to accept food from her students. And he started to understand something important about pride and dignity and what it really meant to be strong. That evening, Tom was doing his usual rounds, mopping the hallway floors and humming along to the radio he always carried with him. He passed by Mrs. Rivera's room and saw her through the window, still there even though it was late, putting up new decorations on the bulletin board. But she was singing to herself, something cheerful and off-key, and there was a half-eaten apple on her desk that she'd saved from her lunch. Tom smiled to himself and kept mopping. He didn't need recognition for what he'd done. Didn't need anyone to know he'd been the one to set things in motion. What mattered was that a good teacher who cared about her students could now afford to eat lunch. What mattered was that a classroom full of kind-hearted kids had learned something valuable about compassion and community. Sometimes the most important work happens in the background, done by people nobody notices. Tom understood that. He'd been doing that kind of work his whole life, and as he emptied trash cans and turned off lights in empty classrooms, he felt good about the small part he'd played in making things a little bit better. Because that's how change really happens. Not through big dramatic gestures, but through small acts of noticing, caring, and doing something about what you see. A boy shares his lunch. Other kids follow his example. A custodian pays attention and speaks up. A principal takes action. And suddenly someone who was struggling finds solid ground again. It wasn't a fairy tale ending where everyone lived happily ever after. Mrs. Rivera still had student loans to pay off. Danny and his grandmother still had to watch every penny. Tom still worked nights cleaning schools. But they were all a little bit better off than they'd been before, a little bit more connected to each other, a little bit more certain that people could be good and kind even when life was hard. And sometimes, that's enough. Years would pass before Danny fully understood what had happened in that second-grade classroom. At 7 years old, he'd just been trying to help someone who needed it. He hadn't thought about it as anything special or remarkable. It was just what his grandmother had taught him to do, what felt right in his heart. The rest of second grade went by, and then 3rd grade and 4th. Mrs. Rivera stayed at Riverside Elementary, becoming one of those teachers that students remembered long after they left her classroom, the kind who learned every student's name, who stayed late to help anyone struggling, who spent her own money on supplies because she couldn't stand to see a kid go without. But there was something else too. Mrs. Rivera started doing something unusual. Every year, on the first day of school, she'd talk to her new class about kindness and community. She'd tell them a story about 2nd graders who'd once taken care of their teacher, though she never mentioned names. And in every classroom she taught, Mrs. Rivera kept a basket on a shelf by her desk with a sign above it: extra food to share. Anyone with extra could put it in. Anyone who needed extra could take something. No questions asked. No shame involved. Danny moved through school, growing from a small, quiet boy into a teenager and then a young man. His grandmother kept working her 2 jobs, kept making his lunches every morning, kept teaching him through her actions what it meant to live with dignity and compassion even when life was hard. "You got a good heart, baby," she'd tell him. "That's worth more than all the money in the world." When Danny was in high school, his grandmother got sick. The medical bills started piling up, impossibly high. He got a part-time job trying to help, but it was like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon. And then something unexpected happened. Someone anonymously paid off a significant portion of her medical debt. Thousands of dollars just gone, taken care of by a stranger who'd wanted to help. Who would do this? His grandmother kept asking, reading the letter over and over. Why would someone do this for us? Danny had no answer, but he felt something shift inside his chest. Someone had seen them struggling and had helped without being asked, without needing recognition. Kindness was circling back around. His grandmother lived 2 more years after that. 2 years she might not have had if the stress of those bills had continued. When she passed away peacefully, Danny held her hand and thanked her for every sandwich she'd ever made, every sacrifice, every lesson about what it meant to be human. At her funeral, Mrs. Rivera found Danny. "Do you remember 2nd grade? The lunches?" she asked. Danny felt his face get hot. "I didn't know if you'd remember that. Danny, what you did changed my entire life. It changed how I teach, how I see the world. That little act of sharing your lunch rippled out in ways you can't imagine." Danny went to college studying social work because he couldn't imagine doing anything else. His grandmother had taught him to see people who were struggling. Mrs. Rivera had taught him that helping wasn't about having resources. It was about being willing to share what you had. He got a job at a nonprofit helping families experiencing poverty. The pay wasn't great, but it was enough. And in his office, Danny kept a bowl of snacks on his desk. Granola bars, crackers, fruit. The bowl was always full, and clients were always welcome to take what they needed. No questions asked. Some co-workers thought it was insignificant, but Danny knew better. He'd learned long ago that small things could be everything. A sandwich could mean the difference between hunger and fullness. Seeing someone struggle and doing something about it could mean the difference between feeling alone and feeling human. Danny thought about this often as he worked with families. He thought about how the solution had never been about one person doing something big and dramatic. It had always been about many people doing small things consistently, sharing a sandwich, speaking up when you notice something wrong, keeping a bowl of snacks on your desk, being willing to help when you could. Sometimes Danny would visit Riverside Elementary. Mrs. Rivera was still teaching there, mentoring new teachers and running programs for students experiencing poverty. The food basket was still in her classroom, still filling up and emptying out in a rhythm that spoke to ongoing community needs. When people would thank him for helping them, Danny would think of his grandmother and Mrs. Rivera, and that 2nd grade classroom full of kids who'd figured out how to take care of each other, and he'd smile and say, "We're all just sharing our lunches. That's all any of us can do. Share what we have. Pay attention to each other. Be willing to help." Because in the end, that was everything. Not a tale about heroes or dramatic rescues, but a reminder of something simpler and more profound, that we need each other, that we're all struggling in different ways, that the answer isn't found in programs alone, but in the daily choice to be kind, to share, to notice when someone is hurting and do something about it. That's what his grandmother had taught him while making sandwiches before dawn. That's what Mrs. Rivera had taught him by accepting help with grace and then spending her career helping others. That's what those 2nd graders had taught each other by creating their own system of care. We're all just kids with lunches to share, And the sharing is what makes us human. The sharing is what saves us. The sharing is what creates connections strong enough to hold us when life gets too heavy to carry alone.